Oslo. The name Oslo has, for most Israelis, negative connotations. I am a Jew from Israel. I moved to Israel about 29 years ago, 1994, right in the midst of the Oslo process. The first Oslo Accords were signed in September of 1993. The second ones were signed in the end of 1995. And about 30 years has passed since those first signing in Washington. And Oslo, for me then and until today, and for many Israelis, connotes a lot of pain. A lot of pain. I'd like to talk briefly about the pain, to think about perhaps what caused it, so that perhaps we can start to heal from it. It's been 30 years, which in my opinion has just been a great setback in the advance of the state of Israel. It's both Jewish and non-Jewish residents. So let's go back for a moment. Why were these agreements started in Oslo, of all places, the capital of Norway, a northern country, far away from Israel? Well, unfortunately, it seems that the reason is simply because at that time, it was illegal, according to Israeli law, to negotiate with terrorist organizations. And the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, under Yasser Arafat, was considered by Israel and most of the world as a terrorist organization for all the planes they had hijacked, for all the people they had killed. So it was illegal to negotiate with the PLO, so it had to be done secretly. Therefore, similar to someone who wants to do something improper, on a personal level, he dresses up in his dark clothing and goes to a distant city where people don't know him. So too, the Oslo negotiations took place in Oslo with the help of some well-meaning, perhaps, politicians, Norwegian politicians, perhaps not the most knowledgeable about the Middle East, but eager to try to, quote, make peace. And from there, the government, the Israeli government, which had began in 1992, the Israeli government decided to adopt these tentative agreements, which were hammered out in Oslo. And in September of 1993, the Declaration of Principles was signed by the Israeli Prime Minister and Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, in Washington, D.C. According to the Accords, over a period of time, the Arabs living in Israel, who were called the Palestinians, they would form a national council, try to elect a council, and then certain areas of the land of Israel would be handed over to them as for their autonomous control. And then, according to the 1995 Oslo Accords, within 5 years, actually of May 1994, there was another agreement, the Cairo Agreement, at which time Jericho and the Gaza Strip were handed over to Palestinian Authority control. 5 years from that date, they were supposed to reach final status negotiations and settlement, which did not happen. What did happen, unfortunately, was that terrorism increased fourfold. I was in Israel at the time. I can tell you it was a scary time. I would often walk to work instead of taking the bus because there was bus bombings taking place often. Because the problem was, and this was foreseeable, of course, but those who believed in this process didn't want to see it, that there's many groups within the Arabs within Israel. Not all of them get along with each other. They haven't got along with each other historically. That's why they've never had a state there. And not all of them were in favor of this process. Many of them vigorously opposed it. And to express that opposition, they went about killing Israelis. Another part of the pain caused by Oslo was that the land of Israel, specifically the West Bank, the areas captured in 1967 Six-Day War, which had earlier in 1948 been captured by the neighboring states in the War of Independence, by Jordan, mostly Judea and Samaria, and the Golan Heights in the north by Syria, and the Gaza Strip in the south by Egypt. Those areas were recaptured by Israel in 1967. And within those areas, according to the Accords, they were divided into three separate areas, A, B, and C. And A and B were under Arab control, and Area C was under Israeli control. And so the reality, as it became and as it remains to this day, I live in the West Bank, and I can tell you, is that these areas were under Arab control, Palestinian Authority control. Jews are not allowed to enter, and if they do, their mobs attack them and even kill them. And there's large red signs to the entrances of these Arab towns put up by the Israeli government saying that this is under Palestinian Authority control and it's illegal and dangerous for Israelis to enter there. In 2000, another Israeli prime minister who was a political disciple of the one who had signed the Accords tried to reach a final status agreement with Yasser Arafat. He offered them almost 98% of the West Bank, but the offer was rejected, thank goodness. Saved by our enemies sometimes. But these various, the Palestinian Authority has still maintained itself, it still exists, and these areas are still under different control. But in my opinion, one of the fundamental problems with this accord was that although it talked about giving a state to the Arabs in Israel, which of course is a ridiculous thing in my opinion, but although it talked about that, it didn't really mean that, and those who talk about it today don't really mean it. They don't mean a real state. They don't mean a real state with its own armed forces and whatnot. They mean, and they write about in the Accords, if it's just cities under Palestinian Authority control with their own police force, but overall military security borders will be protected by Israel for free. We'll pay the billions of dollars to supply the army, and our soldiers will risk their lives to protect them from Syria and Iran and all the other countries which otherwise overrun them, Egypt, Jordan. And within their enclave, they'll simply have municipal control, etc. Although I might add, there are certain things that, in my opinion, are better under the Palestinian Authority than for Israelis, because the Palestinian Authority doesn't charge income taxes to their residents. In Israel they do, which I think we should change. All the money supplying the Palestinian Authority comes from the import duties which are collected by Israel on goods coming into the Israeli ports destined for the Palestinian Authority regions. They collect the import duties and then they pass them on to the Palestinian Authority. That's how their tax revenue, which is a good source of tax revenue. And I wish the Israeli government's sole tax revenue was also from similar things, or taxes on the large corporations, but not on personal income tax. But that's an aside, forgive me. But this is part of the foolishness of the Accords, which they talked about a state, but they didn't really mean a state. And that leads to frustration on the part of the youth that are living there, who are also incited by the Palestinian Authority towards violence toward Israel, toward hatred toward Israel and Jews. And they grow up feeling that they're somehow being controlled, which in a sense they are because they're not allowed to have their own army, etc. And then, so it increases their animosity and the circle of violence that they keep perpetrating by attacking the Jews in Israel. Part of the problem and pain of Oslo is a greater problem that we have in Israel, in my opinion. That is the democratic problem, the democratic deficit, I would call it, in that we don't have a very developed system of government, of democracy in Israel, much less in the United States where I grew up. And a prime minister who has a mere majority, a mere 51% majority in the parliament, can do these crazy things like giving away large parts of the country to another entity. Something which can happen in America, because in America any foreign treaty needs to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate, and the Senate represents all 50 states, individually elected, not just a party elected like in Israel. Because in Israel, the representative is answerable to his party, whereas in America, the representative is answerable to his voters in his district. So what caused Israel to make this step? Obviously, these were well-meaning people, all these people on the Israeli side, they wanted to do good. What was their mistake? I think it's insightful to compare to the Torah portion we read just last week in the synagogues on the Sabbath, Parshas Shalach, you shall send spies. The episode which occurred after the children of Israel left Egypt, and they had been in the desert for a short time, and they decided to send a group of spies into the land of Canaan to survey the land for 40 days, to report on the conditions, on the people. And they came back after 40 days, the 12 spies, one from each tribe, and they said the land was very good and very nice, and here's its beautiful large fruits. But 10 of the spies gave a report saying, we saw really strong, giant people there. The cities were really strong. It doesn't seem we're able to overcome it. It's just too much. And that caused a panic among the men. They got scared. They said, oh my goodness, what have we done? Why did we leave Egypt? Let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt. And this caused heaven to become very upset. And there was a will to destroy all of the Israelites and start again with Moses. And Moses interceded on behalf of the people, and we were allowed to live. However, there was a decree passed that whole generation would stay in the desert and die in the desert during the next 40 years, 1 year for each day they had toured out the land. And only their children would come into the land of Canaan. And I think it's been 30 years now since the Oslo Accords were signed. I think that the Oslo Accords, in a sense, were the sin of the spies of our day, caused by a similar feeling. That feeling being that it was simpler in the past. The challenges of the present are too great. Let's go backwards. The generation of leaders which signed and initiated the Oslo Accords had grown up in the young state of Israel between 1948 and 1967, when Israel was much smaller. Before the Six-Day War, 1967, when the Judea and Samaria were taken in the Golan Heights and the Gaza Strip. And for them it was too much. They were afraid. They said, oh, we can't handle ruling such a big country with so many Arabs in it. Let's downsize. Let's downsize back to where we were before 67. We'll just have a Jewish ghetto here. We won't have to have all these Arabs around us in our country. They also cited the demographic time bomb. They said the Arabs are going to increase much faster than us, and we're going to become outnumbered if we hold on to all these territories. something which hasn't panned out in the past 50 years. There was parties on the right who also issued the same warning. Some of them advocated encouraging the Arabs to leave, to immigrate to Canada, what have you. But neither of these warnings are essentially the same warning. The demographic time bomb has materialized. The population ratio has maintained constant. And what we haven't done is try to integrate and work with the reality. Instead of, in the past 30 years, instead of moving forward with confidence that we're able to build a strong democracy which has full civil rights for its minorities, even if those minorities are oftentimes violent and hostile, but we're able to maintain their rights and the rights of all the residents of the country. Because that's what it's about. That's what it's about. Dealing with the reality. The reality is that most countries in the world are racially mixed. And the challenge is how to live together, how to have a strong democracy which protects minority rights. And Israel can do that, but we have to stop looking for simple solutions like running back to Egypt or running back to pre-1967 Israel. We have to say that if God has brought us this far, He can bring us forward. And we're up to the challenge, and life is about dealing with contradictions and dealing with challenges. So let us hope and pray that it doesn't take more than 40 years to atone for this mistake of Oslo, that we'll learn the lessons, face the pain, and start to heal.